Hey all, in this video we're going to be looking at short-run production costs. And so short-run production costs are extremely important because we're going to learn about all the different cost curves that make up our graphs for perfect competition, which is the last part of this unit, and also the entirety of Unit 4, which are monopolies, oligopolies, and monopolistic competition. So it's really important that you understand the concepts that are presented and taught during this video. Okay, let's go. All right, so short-run production costs. And so to start off, we first have to distinguish between the difference in long run and short run. And so it's really important to note that the short run is not a specific set amount of time. And this is something that gets a lot of students confused, right? When we say short run or long run, a lot of students just want to immediately go to, well, short run is less than 6 months and the long run is 5 years or more. Well, that is not true. Short run for us is where at least one resource is fixed. And remember, in our last video, we went over the difference between fixed resources and variable resources. In the long run, all resources are variable, meaning that there are no fixed resources in the long run. And so if there is at least one fixed resource, you are always in the short run here. And so keeping that in mind, we get into our short run cost curves. And so the reason for this slide is from this point on, for the rest of the year, for the rest of microeconomics, we are going to be using these acronyms instead of actually spelling out average fixed costs, average variable and variable costs, and so on and so on. Well, for us, right, these per unit costs are the most significant thing. Why? Well, because the graphs from here on out in both for the rest of Unit 3 and Unit 4 are going to be using the AFC, the AVC, the ATC, and the marginal cost curves. All right, so it's really important that you know at least those 4 per unit cost curves. And so here, right, we're going over the difference between fixed and variable costs, which is basically the same thing as the difference between fixed and variable resources. Fixed costs, right, are costs that don't change with the amount produced. Just like how fixed resources are resources that don't change based on the amount of products you are producing here. So an example would be an oven, right? The cost of the oven doesn't change no matter how many pizzas or how many baked goods you're making, right? If you're making 100 apple pies versus 1 apple pie, the oven still costs the same. Hence, it's a fixed cost. Well, variable costs are costs for variable resources that do change as more or less is produced. Well, here, in the last video, we gave the example of variable resources while running the pizza shop, right? Those were all the ingredients needed to produce the pizza. Well, the costs for those ingredients are variable costs, because if you're producing 100 pizzas, you're going to be spending more on ingredients compared to if you're only making 1 pizza. You're obviously spending less on those ingredients here. Right? And so fixed cost, variable costs are just tied to fixed resources and variable resources. And then we get total cost and marginal cost. You guys should know this. Total cost is just fixed plus variable, right? So if we're going to write this out, right? So total cost equals our fixed cost plus our variable costs. And then our marginal cost, yet again, we have this weird definition, additional cost of an additional unit of output. Basically, you calculate marginal costs the same way we calculated marginal product, marginal utility, and marginal benefit, right? So let's say we have the quantity from 1, 2, and 3. The total cost is 5 to 15 to 35. Well, then our marginal cost for the first unit is going to be 5. Well, from the first to the second quantity, right, it costs us an additional $10 or 10 units. And then from the second to third, it costs an additional 20, right? So basically, marginal costs we are calculating in the same way. And so here, right, I said that the most important curves here are going to be our marginal cost, which is in red, which it got cut off. So marginal cost, our average total cost, our average variable cost, and our average fixed cost. So here, the 2 things I wanted to point out here is that the average total and the average variable cost get closer and closer but never touch. They are something what we're going to call asymptotes. So in other words, when you're drawing out your average total cost, and your average variable cost, you have to make sure that the average variable cost is getting closer and closer and closer to our average total cost. However, they're never going to touch. And then the difference between our average total and our average variable is always going to be our average fixed cost here, right? So that's why we have this right here. And so why is this true? Well, here, right, if we know that our fixed cost plus our variable cost equals our total cost, we can honestly assume also that our average fixed cost plus our average variable cost also gets us to our average total cost here. And so here, right, we can rewrite this equation by saying average fixed cost equals our average total cost minus our average variable cost, which means the difference between these two curves here, right, our average total or average variable, is always going to get us to our average fixed cost. And so here, I want you guys to pause the video for a second, and then just try to fill in this chart by yourself. All right, so we're going to show the answers in a little bit. And so what I want to go over now is going to be the shape of the cost curves. Why is our marginal cost curve shaped like a Nike swoosh? Why is our average total cost shaped like a smiley face or a gigantic U? So the first one is, why does our marginal cost always go down? Right? And we know this, right? It goes down and then it goes back up. In other words, why does our marginal cost curve look like a Nike swoosh? Well, the reason for that is because of the relationship between production and cost. So in our last video, we went over the marginal product, right? And we went over why it increases then decreases. Because of diminishing marginal returns, we get to a point where workers start to get in each other's way, that they start to actually bring less and less to the table. And so that's why it says here, as more workers are hired, their marginal product increases and eventually decreases because of diminishing marginal returns. Well, here, right, there's a relationship between production and cost. If workers are becoming more efficient in this round, well, here, the average or the marginal cost of each worker is going to start to decrease. However, right, as workers start to become less and less efficient, in other words, as our marginal product starts to decrease, well, their efficiency goes down, and so the marginal cost of each worker starts to go back up. And that's that third point on the screen here. So the reason why our marginal cost curve goes down then up, or in other words, looks like a Nike swoosh, is because, right, as workers, because of specialization and increasing marginal returns, as each worker brings more and more to the table, and so marginal product is increasing, the marginal cost starts to decrease because each worker is becoming more efficient. However, we get to the point of decreasing returns and negative marginal returns where marginal product just decreases because of diminishing returns, because of the fact so many workers are getting each other's way, right, that eventually they become less and less efficient. And so the marginal cost, as workers are getting less efficient, starts to go back up. And so this leads us to, well, then if our marginal cost is a Nike swoosh, well, why is our average total cost a smiley face? Why is it a U-shaped thing, right? Well, here, right, it's real simple. When our marginal cost is below the average, it pulls the average down. When our marginal cost is above the average, it pulls the average up. So let's look at an example here. So let's look at test grades, right? Something that's near and dear to a lot of your guys' heart. So let's say that your average for the class, right, is an 80%, right? And let's say that's your average grade for quarter two. Well, what's something that could impact the grade? Well, the marginal test, right? The next additional test. Well, let's say that our marginal test, and we're going to label this empty for marginal test, is an 85%. Well, if the next test that you get is an 85% and your quarter average is an 80%, what is that going to do for your average quarter two grade? Well, obviously, it's going to pull that average up. Well, what happens, right, if our marginal test score then was a 60%? what is that going to do to your average quarter grade? Well, here, if our average is an 80 and the next test you score at 60%, that's obviously going to pull the average down, right? So here, that's basically the same thing that we're talking about with marginal cost and average total cost here, right? So if you notice, while marginal cost is below our ATC, right? So I'm going to highlight this in yellow. So this portion right here, while it's below the ATC, it's going to pull that average down. Our average total cost curve is going to be downward sloping. However, right, when our marginal cost curve is above our ATC, it's going to pull that average back up. Right? And so it's important to note here, right, that this portion of the marginal cost curve, yes, it is upward sloping. However, it's still below our ATC, right? So it's still going to pull that average down. It's basically saying if you go from like a 75 to a 78% on two tests back to back, but your average is an 85, right? Those two test scores, while you did increase the score on the second test, it's still below your quarter average of an 85. So it's still going to pull your average quarter grade down. And so here, I guess the core of it is what's bolded at the very bottom. The marginal cost curve is always going to intersect our ATC at the ATC's lowest point. So whenever you're drawing your average total cost curves, and we'll do this in dark blue, right? Your ATC is always going to look like a smiley face. Your marginal cost should always intersect at the minimum point of our ATC. And so this brings us to our last portion, which is just shifting the cost curves, right? So what can shift our AVC, our AFC, our marginal cost, and our average total cost curves here? So here's the answer for the chart that you guys did above, right? So take a moment, check your answers. These are all the correct answers here. But let's say we introduce a new scenario. What happens if fixed costs increase to $200? Right? So if we're looking at this original graph or original chart, what is going to happen if fixed costs increases to $200? Well, here, obviously, right, our fixed cost is going to increase. And so that means our total costs increase, which should make sense, right? Remember, our total cost is just our variable cost plus our fixed cost, which gets to our total cost. So if our fixed cost increases, our total costs also have to increase. Well, here, if fixed cost and total cost increases, well, how does that affect these four curves? Our marginal costs, our AVC, AFC, and ATC. Well, here, basically, this is the question I'm asking. Well, if our fixed cost changes, which of our per unit cost curves are also going to change? Well, here, the only two that are going to change is our average our average fixed cost and our average total cost. Why? Well, because our average fixed cost is just our fixed cost divided by quantity. Our average total cost is going to be just our total cost divided by quantity, or we could say total produced, right? And so if our fixed cost and total cost changes, well, it stands to reason that our average fixed cost and our average total cost also changes here. And you can check the math here, right? But the math is going to work out. And so at the end of the day, if fixed cost changes, the only thing that changes for our per unit cost curves, the only thing that's going to change on our graph is going to be our AFC and our ATC. Our marginal cost and our average variable cost do not change when only our fixed cost changes here. All right. So what happens if our variable costs increase? All right. So what happens if our variable costs increase? Well, if our variable costs increase, our total cost is also going to increase, which yet again should make sense, right? If our variable cost plus our fixed cost equals our total cost here, well, if our variable costs increase, then obviously to balance our equation, our total cost should also increase. Well, that's the easy part. Well, here, if our variable cost changes, well, which per unit cost curves, right? So out of our marginal cost, our average variable cost, average fixed, and average total cost, which one of these per unit cost curves are going to change when our variable cost changes? Well, here, right, we're going to say our marginal cost is going to change, our average variable cost is going to change, and our ATC is going to change. Our marginal cost, well, first off, before we get to marginal cost, our average variable and average total cost should be pretty simple why they change, right? Because our total variable and our total cost also changed. So it stands to reason that our average variable and average total also changed here. Our marginal cost also changes because our variable cost increased, right? Our variable cost changed. And so when our variable cost changes, right, that changes our total cost, which then changes our marginal cost here, which is very different from our fixed costs, right? Because our fixed costs, when our fixed costs change, only our average fixed and average total cost change, which makes sense because our fixed cost is always going to change at the same amount, while our variable costs is going to change at different amounts here. And because of that, our marginal cost is going to shift or change when our variable cost increases or decreases. So at the end of the day, if a variable cost changes, if total variable cost changes, our marginal cost, our average variable cost, and our average total cost are also going to change. All right, so that leads to the practice AP questions. There is going to be a separate video that goes over these practice AP questions here. I think there's about 6 of them, so keep an eye out for that. So that's it. That's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys learned a lot, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.